So Disobedient Electronics is looking at work from industrial designers, artists, media artists, also DIY practitioners and makers, and some projects from the commercial industry that use electronics and building electronic artifacts in a political kind of way to make a point or to make an argument about how culture and society can be improved or how it can be made better. So it's really looking at objects that disobey some sort of convention in order to bring about political change. So the project has a lot of different examples in it. Some of them are, there's one project called the 79% work clock that works to try to highlight the wage gap between women and men. That's an alarm clock that, because women on average, at least in North America, get paid 79% of what men do. So this alarm clock goes off at 3:40 in the afternoon or something like this at 79% of the workday to remind women that they could, pack up and go home because they're not getting paid. And it's also an object that serves as a reminder to other people in the office that there is a gender pay gap. So that's one example. Other examples include the graffiti writer by Institute of Applied Autonomy that spray paints graffiti on a remote controlled car, so like a dot matrix printer down on the ground, and can quickly travel through a space, a public square, and put some sort of subversive tag on the ground. Other examples include the Barbie Liberation Organization, which was involved in swapping the voice boxes of talking G.I. Joe dolls and Barbie dolls. So they went and purchased a bunch of talking G.I. Joes and talking Barbies. They took them back to their workspace, swapped the voice boxes, and put them back onto the shelves. And then the G.I. Joes, and then people repurchased them. They don't sort of gifted them back to the stores, and then people bought them and would, make the Barbie talk and would go like, "Eat lead, you're gonna die." And then the G.I. Joes would go, "I'd love to go shopping, isn't this great?" And so in that way, that looked at gender stereotypes with toy manufacturers. I think that the book serves as a good example as to how to do critical making. I think it's a good example of how things like the maker culture, 3D printers and Arduinos, for example, that's quite popular at the moment and has been for the past nearly decade, how those can be used and worked with in interesting ways. Because I think after you 3D print something or get LED blinking on your microcontroller, there's a problem of content. What are you going to do and what are you going to produce? And so I think technologists and makers can really learn from the history of design theory, of art history, of media art, that have grappled with these sort of questions and really can help with bringing that technology into an interesting, give it an interesting social dynamic. So I think that one thing for me, an interesting question that I'm currently thinking about and sorting out is this idea of functionality. How do objects that are done as critical design objects or critically made objects, how functional do they need to be? And I don't think there's one right answer. I think several different things can be built to serve several different purposes. But the way that I see the spectrum of it is that critical and speculative design seems to be a bit more focused on building out a narrative and using an object to build a narrative, often through video or documentation. Where if you go over, I see, to critical making, there's a bit more emphasis on the functionality of the object, where you see small deployments, sort of a bespoke manufacturing that could circulate in an art context, a limited run of objects that operate. It could still be in a gallery, it might be in public as a display, but it's much more a prototype technology. And then if you move over to a field like human-computer interaction, where you have things like probes, research through design, you have that extended further where you have these objects that are able to be deployed in field studies and researched over a longer period of time. And then you have fully mass manufactured objects on the one side, on the other extreme. So I think there's many different ways in that spread of functionality that can operate. In some ways, it's not necessarily easier to build a non-functioning object because you can take a lot of time in building out the concept to it. But it does get quite slow and quite tedious, and you need a different set of expertise to build through the electronics and make it function. But for me, it's quite interesting to see those objects being deployed in the real world because you have code repositories that people can borrow from, open source kind of model, and build out other objects out of them, have them deployed. And for me, the functional object, and functional is a little bit in scare quotes, as an interesting place because I think it has a different legibility. And both can be very persuasive. You can have a very persuasive narrative, or you can have a very persuasive object. But for me, I tend to sort of try to steer toward the functional object. Not always successful, though. So I work at Emily Carr University in Vancouver, Canada, and I run a space there called the Studio for Critical Making. And the basic premise there is to use the humanities and things like ethics, history, social issues, how those can inform developing technologies. And in my case, it's focused on electronic technologies, information technologies, you could say. And so in my space, I have a theory side of it. I have a library of books and archive of research and texts, and a section where I do writing, and then a section where I do building. So electronics prototyping, CNC manufacturing, 3D printing, and saws and drills and that sort of stuff. So in the space, I take students and work with them on their projects, graduate students typically, and try to help develop their concept behind their project and try to develop it so that it functions. And those are they can be quite complicated things. So my goal in that space is to bring those two things together, and sometimes people need more technical help and sometimes they need more theoretical help. So it just depends on the student. Media archaeology, I think, is interesting from the perspective of having an emphasis on technologies that and historical paths that never quite made it, or maybe that are no longer in existence. So I see media archaeology as a form of media history that is more interested in the marginalia around not so much the mainline technologies, but the sideline technologies. And for me, this is interesting because I see a lot of artists being interested in those less traveled paths and developing them. Sometimes they're working historically, or sometimes they're developing their own paths, new paths in some way. So I think that media archaeology really comes into play with critical design or with making, because it brings a sense of history and background that says to people who are maybe going into a new technology to sort of step back and look at a wider perspective of tools, of ways of perceiving the world, of different technologies, of different histories and different narratives that aren't the standard kind of narratives. So I think this media archaeology is a really useful resource as a place for artists and designers to draw from. And I find those less traveled paths really important in my own work. And I see that in several other artists that are working with technology as well. Digital design for me is a lot of things, because I do graphic design, book layout, and electronics. For the most part, digital design, I tend to be focused on physical artifacts. I generally don't tend to work on screen-based media. And for me, I don't know if that's my age or my nostalgia over physical objects, but I do like the agency of a physical thing, whether that's a book, whether that's a robot, or whatever. I have an attraction to the tactile. And so digital media or digital design, for me, I tend to look at microcontrollers and things that are haptic and physical in some format.